The first thing anyone noticed about her was the way she carried herself through suffering. Quiet, small, almost invisible, yet impossibly resilient. Lila had grown up in the city's shadowed alleys, the kind of place where kindness was often punished and cruelty was the norm. She worked long hours as a maid in the sprawling Blackthorn estate, a mansion of obsidian towers and frozen fountains, where the elite mingled and whispered secrets older than time itself. Lila was constantly overlooked, often mocked for her worn shoes, her tattered apron, her soft-spoken nature. Yet there was something in her eyes, a spark of light that refused to be snuffed out, even as the cold world pressed down on her fragile shoulders. It was during one of her nightly chores that she first saw him, not in the flicker of candlelight or the glint of silver, but in a shadow carved against the obsidian walls. Valerius, the vampire king, stood alone on the balcony, his presence an impossible blend of dread and majesty. Legends called him cruel, untouchable, a being whose gaze alone could wither men's courage. But Lila, for reasons she could not name, did not fear him. She watched quietly, noticing the way the moonlight painted his angular features, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the distant loneliness hidden behind centuries of power. That evening, fate moved in quiet, cruel ways. A drunken guest at the estate sneered at her, mocking the threadbare apron she wore as if her humanity were a crime. Lila's hands trembled, but she did not fight back. She simply bowed her head and allowed the insult to wash over her. But Valerius, unseen and silent, had witnessed everything. Something within him stirred, a mixture of curiosity, disdain for those who harmed the weak, and a spark of something far older, far stranger. He stepped from the shadows, and when the guests' laughter rang in the hall, it abruptly died. A whisper of a shadow, a chill in the air, and the man stumbled back, struck by an invisible force. Lila did not know that the king had intervened, his presence alone enough to enforce justice. After that night, Lila's world subtly shifted. She found small, mysterious gifts appearing where she least expected them. A feather of impossible blue left on her windowsill, a piece of obsidian carved into a delicate flower beside her broom. She never knew who left them, but each item was a quiet acknowledgement that she mattered, that she had been seen. And Valerius, from his towers of isolation, watched. He noticed her bravery in small acts, the way she comforted an injured bird she found in the garden, the way she whispered kind words to the servants no one else noticed, the quiet defiance in her gaze when injustice crossed her path. Yet, when he finally spoke her name in the hall, it was not praise he offered but a word that stung like ice. "Clingy," he said lightly to his closest confidants, a laugh shared among centuries-old friends, oblivious to the walls he had built around himself. The word, casual and dismissive, struck Lila harder than any insult from the drunken man weeks ago. She felt the warmth of the gifts, the acknowledgement of her existence, vanish in a heartbeat. Her heart tightened, a fragile bird caught in a storm. She slipped away, retreating to the solitude of her tiny attic room, letting silence consume her as her only companion. That night, alone with her thoughts, Lila questioned everything. Had her acts of kindness been meaningless? Had her quiet bravery been nothing but annoyance in the eyes of the one she had unconsciously devoted herself to? Her fingers brushed over the small wooden bird she had carved, a gift she had hoped to leave for him. Its delicate beak had broken as it hit the floor, and for a moment, it felt as though her own spirit had fractured alongside it. Yet, beneath the sting of rejection, a seed of defiance took root. She would not allow one word to erase the courage she had nurtured all her life. She would continue to be kind, to be brave even if no one, not even the feared vampire king, recognized it. And somewhere, high above in the cold corridors of the Blackthorn estate, Valerius returned to his chambers, unaware of the weight his careless words had carried. The laughter of friends still echoed faintly in his mind, a comfort to his weary immortal soul, yet a strange emptiness lingered. For though he had dismissed her as clingy, he found himself thinking of her small, silent presence more than he could admit. And so, an invisible thread tied them together, one of quiet devotion and reluctant fascination, stretching across the cold void of centuries, waiting for the moment it would finally pull taut. The morning sunlight found Lila in her small attic room, the broken wooden bird lying in the corner as a silent witness to the weight of her heart. Her hands trembled slightly as she straightened her apron and smoothed her hair back from her face. The world outside her window moved on without care, oblivious to the ache that had rooted itself inside her chest the night before. She had told herself she would not cry, that she would not allow the careless dismissal of a word, clingy, to define her worth. Yet, in the quiet corners of her mind, the echoes of laughter haunted her, a cruel reminder that even the smallest kindness could be misread, misunderstood, or ridiculed. Down in the grand halls of Blackthorn Estate, life continued as if nothing had happened. Valerius moved through the corridors with his usual predatory grace, every footstep measured, every gesture precise. To his court he was unapproachable, a storm in human form, beautiful, immortal, terrifying. Yet beneath that veneer of power and control, a flicker of unease gnawed at him. The word he had spoken to his friends lingered like smoke in the cold air of the palace. Clingy. It had been casual, almost careless, but in the silence that followed, he found himself thinking of her. The human girl who had fascinated him with her unassuming bravery, her quiet acts of love, her resilience against a world that had treated her so cruelly. Her absence from the halls that morning was immediately noticeable, though few dared to comment. Servants whispered in low tones, speculating whether Lila had simply vanished or if she had finally allowed herself to be swallowed by the relentless pressure of her existence. Valerius, standing at the head of the marble staircase, felt an unexpected tug in his chest, a subtle foreign sensation he had not experienced in centuries. For reasons he could not explain, he wanted to see her, to know she was safe, to hear her voice, even if only for a moment. Hours passed and still she remained absent. The estate seemed unusually hollow without her presence, as if the walls themselves missed the soft rhythm of her footsteps. Valerius, despite himself, began to search, not openly but quietly, gliding through corridors with the silence of a shadow, following the faint trace of her scent. It was delicate, almost fleeting, yet distinct among the faint perfumes of the palace. He paused at the doorway to her quarters, lingering on the threshold, staring at the broken bird and the traces of Lila's quiet life. She had retreated, but she had left her mark, tiny fragments of herself scattered like breadcrumbs through the cold halls of his world. Meanwhile, Lila struggled to navigate the halls of her own heart. The shame of being dismissed, even by someone she had revered from a distance, weighed heavily on her. She questioned her every motive. Had she been foolish to believe that small acts of kindness mattered? Had she imagined a connection where there was none? And yet, beneath the fear and humiliation, another force stirred, a stubborn, quiet determination. She would not allow herself to be broken. She would continue to act with courage and kindness, even if the world did not notice, even if the vampire king himself remained distant. There was power in resilience, she realized, and she intended to wield it, silently, like the steady pulse of a heart that refused to surrender. Days passed with the slow, oppressive weight of monotony, punctuated by fleeting glances from the shadows. Valerius observed her from afar, intrigued by the way she moved through the world. She was no longer the small, fearful girl who had trembled under the jeers of the drunkard in the hall. There was a quiet dignity to her steps now, a subtle grace that drew the eye without demanding attention. He noticed how she cared for the other servants, speaking softly to those in pain, lifting spirits with gentle words or a reassuring hand. There was bravery in her humility, strength in her silence, and it unsettled him in ways he could not name. One evening, as the moon rose high over the Blackthorn estate, Valerius found himself drawn to the gardens, a place of frost-kissed beauty and quiet solitude. The roses were withered and blackened, yet Lila moved among them with care, her hands gentle against the thorn stems. She hummed softly, a tune so fragile and human that it carried across the still night air like a whispered prayer. Valerius stood on the balcony above, watching her, and for the first time he felt the stirring of something profound, a combination of fascination, longing, and a protective instinct that he had thought buried beneath centuries of solitude. It was then that the first real test of Lila's courage presented itself. A group of mercenaries, remnants of a human rebellion that had sought to challenge the vampire court, had infiltrated the estate's grounds. They moved silently, weapons drawn, unaware of the presence of the vampire king. Lila, noticing their approach, froze for a heartbeat, her instincts screaming for her to hide. But she did not run. Instead, she reached for a small vial of herbal concoction she had been crafting for the roses, flinging it at the intruders with surprising precision. The liquid burned the skin of the attackers, forcing them to stagger back, and in that brief moment of chaos, she had enough time to retreat to the shadows, her heart pounding. Valerius, observing from above, descended like a shadow, his presence immediate and overwhelming. The intruders barely had time to react before he struck, his movements a blur, swift and merciless. They fell to the ground, incapacitated, while Lila watched from the safety of the garden wall, her pulse racing with a mix of fear and awe. When the danger passed, he approached her, his eyes dark with an intensity she had not yet fully understood. "You acted without fear," he said, his voice low and measured, carrying both approval and a subtle reprimand. "Even when you had every reason to run." Lila's throat tightened, words caught in her chest. She nodded silently, unable to speak, and for once, the silence between them carried more weight than any spoken confession. Valerius studied her, his gaze lingering, and in that moment, a bond began to form, not of possession but of mutual recognition. He understood her courage, her resilience, and her refusal to be diminished by fear or cruelty. She, in turn, saw him not just as a distant, cold king, but as a protector whose power could shield her from a world that had treated her so harshly. Yet even as this connection deepened, the delicate balance of the estate's politics loomed over them. Valerius' court whispered about the human girl who had captured the king's attention, speculating on her motives, her lineage, her worth. Lila felt the eyes of the court upon her, and though she did not respond, the knowledge of their scrutiny weighed heavily. She was a human among immortals, fragile yet persistent, and the world around her did not always understand the quiet strength she possessed. The days that followed were filled with tension and unspoken questions. Valerius found reasons to linger near her quarters, offering small gestures of acknowledgement, a discarded rose, a warm cloak left by her bed, a soft murmur of approval as she completed her chores. Each act was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet for Lila they were monumental. She began to understand that her bravery and kindness had not gone unnoticed, that the vampire king's attention, though often veiled in detachment, was a sign of a connection deeper than mere curiosity. And still she remained silent, unsure how to navigate the complex web of power, fear, and admiration that surrounded her. She had learned the hard way that words could wound, and in the presence of one so powerful, silence felt safer, more honest. Yet even in her quiet, Valerius could sense the strength of her spirit, the resilience of her heart, and the subtle, unspoken truth that she was far more remarkable than she realized. As the moon rose high once again over Blackthorn Estate, Valerius stood on the balcony, watching Lila move among the shadows of the garden. He could not bring himself to speak the words he longed to, not yet, not until he understood the depth of her resolve, the quiet fire that burned within her. And Lila, unaware of the eyes that followed her, continued her silent vigil among the roses, tending to the fragile life she nurtured, building courage one careful act at a time. In the stillness of that night, a bond had been formed, tentative yet unbreakable. It was a bond not of words but of recognition, of shared understanding, of unspoken respect. Lila had proven her courage, her kindness, her resilience, and in doing so had captured the attention of a being whose power spanned centuries. Valerius, for the first time in decades, felt a stir of something he had thought long dead, an emotional pull, a need to protect, to cherish, to witness her growth. The Blackthorn Estate had never been so quiet and so alive at the same time. Lila moved through the halls as if in a dream, her soft footsteps echoing faintly against the polished marble. Every corner of the mansion seemed imbued with the weight of centuries, the cold stone, the flicker of torchlight, the shadows that danced like living things along the walls. Yet she was no longer merely a ghost among them. Something within her had shifted since that night in the garden, when courage had met the bite of danger, when Valerius' gaze had recognized her bravery. That night had left her shaken, yes, but it had also awakened a new confidence, a quiet certainty that she was not merely insignificant, not merely fragile. Yet confidence alone could not erase the unease she felt each time she moved through the estate. Whispers followed her like the hiss of wind through a narrow passage. Servants cast curious glances, and even some of the courtly vampires, those accustomed to centuries of power games, eyed her with suspicion. Lila, who had spent her life shrinking in the presence of cruelty, now carried herself with an invisible armor, a mix of humility and dignity that kept most from daring to mock her. Still, the weight of being watched, analyzed, and judged never fully left her. Valerius, meanwhile, felt an unfamiliar restlessness. He prowled the halls like a predator without a hunt, yet it was not prey that drew him forward, it was her. Lila had become a fixed point in his eternity, a thread of warmth in the cold expanse of centuries. And yet he struggled with himself. He had centuries of training in command, in strategy, in the art of detachment. To feel something like concern, even affection for a fragile human girl was both alien and dangerous. It unsettled him, gnawed at the careful walls he had built around his heart. The tension between them grew silently, in gestures, in fleeting glances, in moments of near proximity that both craved and feared. Lila had learned to read him, to sense when his mood darkened or softened, when the air around him vibrated with the raw, untamed power of the undead. And yet, she kept her distance, wary of provoking either his wrath or disappointment. She had learned that survival in a world of immortals required caution, and in this delicate balance, a subtle dance of recognition and restraint had begun. One evening, the estate received news that would test them both in ways neither expected. A group of humans from the nearby town had ventured too close to the estate, drawn by rumors of the Vampire King's power. They were desperate, hungry, frightened, a mob seeking answers and vengeance for grievances that had nothing to do with Lila, but everything to do with the fear of the unknown. Word spread quickly, and the estate descended into controlled chaos. Guards were mobilized, corridors were secured, and Valerius moved with swift precision, orchestrating a response that balanced protection and intimidation. Lila, drawn by both curiosity and the need to ensure the safety of those weaker than herself, ventured to the edge of the disturbance. From the shadows, she saw terrified children, trembling mothers, and men whose courage had failed them long before they reached the estate. It was a scene that stirred something primal within her, the need to act, to help, to ease suffering in whatever small way she could. She moved among them, offering water, comforting words, and an unshakable calm that drew their attention. In that moment she was no longer merely a maid, no longer merely human. She was a beacon of hope, a fragile but undeniable force of goodness in a world defined by fear and power. Valerius observed her from the towers, his eyes narrowing. There was danger in her bravery, he knew it instinctively. A human, vulnerable and exposed, daring to insert herself between the powerful and the frightened, was asking for trouble. And yet, there was something undeniably magnetic about the way she moved, so different from the courtiers and immortals who surrounded him. She was unyielding, gentle, and brave, and for reasons he could not entirely articulate, it stirred something long dormant within him, a sense of pride, of protective instinct, of fascination that went beyond mere admiration. As the mob grew restless, a man broke from the group, brandishing a crude weapon, intent on proving himself against the rumors of the Vampire King's wrath. Lila saw him, heart hammering, and stepped between him and a terrified child. She raised her hands not in defiance but in appeal, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt in her chest. "Stop. You don't understand. Violence isn't the answer." The man laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "And who are you to tell us that?" he sneered. "A girl who hides behind the walls of the rich and immortal?" Lila's heart clenched, but she did not step back. She had faced fear before and survived. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the will to act despite it. "I may be small," she said softly, "but I see what you do not. You're afraid. And fear makes you cruel. It doesn't have to be that way." The man hesitated, momentarily disarmed by the conviction in her voice. That was all the time Valerius needed. He descended from the towers, his presence like a shadow that swallowed the light. The air shifted, charged with his immense power, and the man faltered, recognizing the inevitability of the king's wrath. Before a single word could be spoken, Valerius moved with lethal grace, subduing the threat without spilling blood, a controlled display of power that left the crowd awed and terrified in equal measure. When the chaos had passed, Lila stood trembling, her courage tested but unbroken. Valerius approached, his eyes locked on hers, a storm of unspoken words and restrained emotion simmering beneath the surface. He extended a hand, not in command but in acknowledgement. "You are reckless," he said, his voice low and measured. "And yet, you act with honor." Lila looked at him, unsure how to respond. Words felt fragile in the face of centuries of power, of judgment, of authority. She nodded silently, understanding that her actions had spoken more than any words ever could. In the silence between them, something shifted, a bond solidified by shared recognition, by the acknowledgement of courage in the face of fear, by the quiet understanding that each had seen the other's true nature. That night, in her small room, Lila reflected on the events of the day. She had faced fear, confronted injustice, and survived. And yet, she felt an unfamiliar flutter in her chest, an awareness that she had caught the attention of a being who could destroy her in an instant, yet chose instead to recognize her strength. She realized that courage was not merely about survival, it was about standing for what was right, even when the odds were impossible. And in doing so, she had forged a connection that went beyond admiration, something deeper, more complex, and infinitely more fragile. Valerius, in the solitude of his chambers, could not shake the image of her standing before the mob, unafraid, resolute, luminous in her humanity. He had spent centuries mastering detachment, controlling desire, suppressing emotion. Yet for the first time he found himself drawn toward something he could not command, the quiet fire of a human heart, the subtle strength of a girl who refused to bow to fear or cruelty. He understood that this was no fleeting infatuation. It was the beginning of something profound, something that would challenge the very foundations of his existence. The nights that followed were filled with small, quiet interactions. Valerius left subtle tokens of acknowledgement, a warm cloak on her bed, a carefully selected flower from the gardens, a brief nod of approval as she completed her chores. Lila, cautious yet perceptive, began to understand the language of his attention. She realized that connection did not always require words. Sometimes, it was in the smallest gestures, in the quietest moments, in the spaces where silence carried more meaning than speech ever could. And yet, beneath this fragile thread of understanding, tension simmered. The court whispered, the city murmured, and the threads of politics and power threatened to entangle them both. Lila was human, mortal, fragile in ways Valerius could not protect completely. And Valerius was a king, immortal, bound by duty and expectation, struggling to reconcile centuries of control with the awakening of something deeply human within him. In the moonlight, they found themselves once again in the garden, shadows entwined with the frost-kissed roses. Words were unnecessary. The silence spoke volumes, a quiet acknowledgement of respect, recognition, and the subtle stirrings of something far more profound. For Lila, it was courage recognized. For Valerius, it was power tempered by admiration. And for both, it was the beginning of a journey neither fully understood, yet could no longer deny. The Blackthorn estate was quiet, but the air carried the weight of unspoken truths. Lila moved through the halls with a newfound awareness, every glance over her shoulder a reminder that she existed in a world not built for her, a fragile human among immortals. The events of the previous nights, the intruders, her courage, the acknowledgement of Valerius, had changed her. She could feel it in the slight straightening of her spine, the subtle lift of her chin, the way her eyes held a spark of defiance. She had survived danger, faced cruelty, and still remained herself. And yet, the memory of his word, clingy, still haunted her. It was a reminder that even recognition from the most powerful could come with pain. Valerius, in his chambers high above the estate, felt a similar unrest. He had watched her silently, unable to deny the growing pull she exerted over him. A human girl, so small, so mortal, yet resilient, brave, and unyielding, she unsettled centuries of carefully honed control. He had tried to maintain distance, to observe from the shadows, to offer small tokens of acknowledgement rather than direct attention. But each act of hers, the quiet kindness to servants, the courage in moments of danger, the delicate gestures of thoughtfulness, pulled at something he did not fully understand. And for the first time in centuries, he began to feel the dissonance between power and desire, between the immortal weight he carried and the human warmth he longed for. The morning brought a messenger from the northern provinces, bearing urgent news. A neighboring vampire house had stirred unrest among the human population, and rumors of rebellion threatened to reach the city. Valerius convened his council, his movements precise and commanding, yet his mind was partly elsewhere. He found his thoughts drifting to Lila, to the fragile human who had faced danger with a quiet bravery that many immortal warriors lacked. In a world defined by strength and cruelty, she had shown honor, humility, and a courage that spoke louder than centuries of training or command. Meanwhile, Lila had begun to notice subtle changes in her surroundings. She found gifts left in quiet corners, a feather, a small carved figure, even a delicate note written in an unfamiliar, almost poetic script. She could not read the language, but the meaning was unmistakable: acknowledgement, recognition, a bond forming in silence. She understood that Valerius was watching, that he had noticed her deeds, that he recognized her humanity as something precious in a world that often overlooked it. Yet, she could not bring herself to approach him. Words felt inadequate, and the fear of disappointment, of misreading his intentions, made her cautious. So, she remained silent, allowing her actions to speak instead of her voice. It was during a late evening in the frost-kissed gardens that the first true test of their fragile connection arose. A messenger from the northern provinces arrived, breathless and terrified, reporting that a group of humans had been taken by rival vampire factions. They had been accused of crimes they did not commit, and their lives were in danger. Lila, upon hearing this, felt an immediate, visceral response. She could not stand idly by while innocents suffered. Her heart pushed her forward, her courage stronger than her fear. Valerius, observing from the shadowed balcony, noted the determination in her posture, the resolve in her eyes. There was a fire within her, fragile yet fierce, and he knew instinctively that she would act, no matter the consequences. When she stepped toward the danger, moving with quiet purpose, he allowed it. Not because he doubted his ability to protect her, but because he was beginning to understand that her courage was not meant to be restrained. It was her gift, her humanity, and it was something even he could not shield from or command. The journey to the northern provinces was perilous. Lila moved among shadows and whispers, guiding terrified humans to safety, her soft voice carrying reassurance that steadied hearts even in the face of mortal fear. Valerius followed at a distance, unseen yet always present, ensuring that the dangers they faced did not become fatal. The interplay between their proximity and distance, between visibility and shadow, became a silent dance, a conversation without words, a bond strengthened through shared risk and unspoken understanding. During one critical moment, a group of rebels confronted them. Armed and desperate, they had no concept of the forces they faced. Lila stepped forward, unarmed, her hands raised in peaceful appeal. "Please," she said softly but firmly, "we do not want to fight. We want only to protect those who cannot protect themselves." The rebels hesitated, momentarily disarmed by the courage of this fragile human. It was enough time for Valerius to emerge from the shadows, his presence like a storm, his power undeniable. The rebels fell silent, awed and terrified, as he moved among them with a precision and authority that made resistance impossible. Yet even as he displayed his dominance, it was clear that he held back, restraining the deadly force within him. He did not need to strike to assert control, the mere knowledge of his power was sufficient. After the danger had passed, they found themselves alone on a frozen hilltop, the moon casting pale light over snow-dusted trees. Lila's breath came in quick, shallow bursts, but her spirit remained unbroken. Valerius approached, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes softened in ways he did not fully understand. "You are reckless," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the cold night. "And yet, you inspire loyalty, even courage in those around you." Lila met his gaze, her silence speaking volumes. Words were inadequate, fragile, fleeting. Her courage had been tested, and she had survived, and she knew that this acknowledgment, though brief and restrained, was as close to a confession as he could give. In the quiet, a bond formed, unspoken yet undeniable, a tether between human fragility and immortal strength. Yet beneath the surface, questions and secrets stirred. Lila began to notice inconsistencies in the estate, in the whispers of servants, in the careful observations of the court. There were hints of old rivalries, hidden powers, and ancient grudges that no mortal could hope to understand fully. She realized that the world she had glimpsed was far more complex than she had imagined, a web of politics, power, and immortality that she was only beginning to navigate. Valerius, too, grappled with the shifting landscape of his heart. He had never allowed himself to feel so deeply, so intensely for a mortal. The pull she exerted was magnetic, almost unbearable, yet he restrained himself, knowing that centuries of experience had taught him the danger of attachment. He began to study her, to understand her fears, her strengths, her quiet acts of heroism, and in doing so he realized that his connection to her was not merely fascination. It was admiration, respect, and something that, in the absence of language, resembled love. In the days that followed, they continued their delicate dance. Valerius left tokens of acknowledgement in hidden corners, small signs of care that Lila understood without explanation. She, in turn, continued her acts of courage and kindness, knowing that her humanity, fragile though it was, had value in this world of immortals. And in their shared silence, the unspoken bond between them deepened, strengthened by respect, mutual recognition, and the quiet understanding that each had seen the other's true nature. It was during one late night, as snow fell softly over the estate, that a revelation came. Lila discovered an old manuscript in the castle library, written in a language she did not recognize. Yet, when she touched it, a strange warmth spread through her fingers, and she found herself understanding the words as though they had been whispered into her soul. The manuscript contained knowledge of healing, ancient rituals, and secrets of the supernatural world, knowledge that could save lives and alter destinies. She realized that she was no ordinary human, that some deeper force had guided her to this knowledge, and that she might be far more significant than she had ever imagined. Valerius sensed the shift immediately. The moment she touched the manuscript, he felt a tremor in the threads of fate that connected them. He knew without question that she had power beyond her years, beyond her mortality. And in that recognition, his respect for her deepened further, his desire to protect her growing into something more profound. Yet he understood that power alone did not define her. Her courage, kindness, and humility were what made her extraordinary. As the night deepened and the snow whispered against the castle windows, they found themselves once again in the gardens. Words were unnecessary. The bond between them had grown through courage, silence, and shared experience. Valerius stood close, yet careful, the distance between them charged with unspoken emotion. Lila met his gaze, understanding for the first time that their connection was not merely observation or fascination. It was mutual recognition, respect, and a quiet, simmering affection that neither dared name aloud. The world outside the estate remained dangerous, unpredictable, and cruel. But within the fragile bubble of trust, respect, and acknowledgement, something extraordinary had begun. A bond between human fragility and immortal strength, courage and wisdom, silence and understanding. It was fragile, delicate, and easily broken, yet unyielding in its foundation. The Blackthorn estate had grown colder over the past weeks, not from the frost that settled over the marble floors and frost-kissed gardens, but from the tension that now threaded through its very walls. Lila moved carefully, her movements precise and measured, aware of eyes that watched her from the shadows, some full of curiosity, some of judgment. The events of the past had changed her in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. She had seen danger firsthand, witnessed cruelty, and yet had survived, her courage tempered like steel and fire. But now, a new challenge loomed, one that would test not only her bravery but the latent power she had yet to fully understand. Valerius had noticed the subtle shifts in her demeanor, the quiet confidence, the steady gaze that met his without flinching, the deliberate strength in the way she carried herself. Yet, he could sense something deeper, something hidden beneath the fragile surface of her humanity. He did not yet know the full extent of it, but he knew instinctively that it would not remain dormant for long. He felt both awe and trepidation, the stirring of emotions he had long suppressed. The pull she exerted was undeniable, and he struggled to reconcile his centuries of command and detachment with the stirring of feelings that were as unfamiliar as they were intense. It began with the garden. Lila had been tending to the frostbitten roses when she felt a strange warmth in her hands, a pulse that seemed to emanate from the very soil beneath her feet. At first, she thought it was the residual heat of her own body, but as she concentrated, she realized the warmth responded to her focus, to her intent. The frost on the roses softened under her touch, petals returning to their original form as if kissed by spring. Lila stepped back, awe and fear mingling in her chest. She had always suspected she was different, but this was proof. Something extraordinary resided within her, a power she did not yet fully understand, a gift that might change everything. Valerius, watching from the balcony, felt the shift immediately. A tremor ran through him, not of fear exactly but of recognition. The human girl, fragile and mortal though she appeared, possessed a power that could rival even the most seasoned immortal. And yet, what struck him most was not the power itself, but the way she wielded it with humility, with care, and with a courage that transcended fear. He understood then that she was not merely a mortal to be protected, but a force in her own right, capable of shaping the world around her in ways even he could not control. The first real test of her newfound abilities came sooner than expected. Word reached the estate that a rival vampire faction had begun targeting humans associated with Blackthorn, seeking to destabilize Valerius' rule by harming the vulnerable. Among them were innocent families, merchants, and servants who had unknowingly drawn attention through no fault of their own. Lila could not ignore it. She had faced danger before, yes, but this was different. These were lives at stake, lives that depended on her courage and the power she had only just begun to explore. When she arrived at the outskirts of the human settlement, she found the scene far worse than she had imagined. Homes were smoldering, the air thick with smoke and terror. Humans ran in panic, their faces etched with fear, their bodies trembling as they fled the chaos. Without hesitation, Lila stepped forward, focusing her energy, feeling the pulse of life around her. She extended her hands and a warmth spread outward, slowing the flames, healing wounds, soothing panic. Those who had been injured began to rise, their strength returning, their fear replaced with bewildered hope. For the first time, Lila understood the full extent of her gift. But with power comes danger. The rival faction, sensing resistance, sent a small detachment to confront her. Lila, unarmed in the traditional sense, stood her ground, radiating a force that was both protective and formidable. She did not strike with malice, she did not seek vengeance. She simply asserted the quiet authority of her gift, and the attackers faltered, overwhelmed not by violence but by an invisible strength they could not comprehend. It was an act of courage, of mercy, and of immense power, and it left even Valerius, watching unseen from the shadows, breathless with awe. When she returned to the estate, exhausted but triumphant, Valerius met her in the gardens. His expression was unreadable, but the intensity in his eyes betrayed the tempest of emotions he struggled to contain. "You have power," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "And yet, you use it with such restraint. With such humanity." Lila lowered her gaze, unsure how to respond. I do not know where it comes from," she admitted softly. "But I know it is meant for more than myself. I cannot stand by while others suffer." Valerius stepped closer, the shadows around him stretching as if drawn to his presence. "You have changed," he said. "In ways I cannot fully understand. You are no longer merely human to me. You are remarkable." The word lingered between them, heavy with meaning, yet fragile, as if spoken too loudly might shatter the delicate balance they had maintained. And yet, even as admiration and awe blossomed, so did tension. The court whispered, jealous and wary. Rumors spread among the immortal factions that Valerius had become entangled with a human, an unprecedented and dangerous liaison. Lila, aware of the scrutiny, felt the weight of expectation pressing down upon her fragile shoulders. She was no longer merely a maid, no longer merely a mortal. She had become a symbol, a figure whose courage and power could inspire hope or provoke envy. It was during a council meeting that the danger escalated. One of Valerius' oldest rivals, a vampire lord named Sereth, accused Lila of conspiring with humans to undermine the court. The room fell silent, the accusation hanging in the air like a blade poised above their heads. Lila's heart raced, but she did not falter. She had faced fear before, she would not bow to intimidation now. She met Sereth's gaze steadily, her voice calm yet unwavering. "I have done nothing but protect the innocent. The lives I have touched do not belong to your politics or your schemes. They are human, yes, but they are deserving of compassion, not cruelty." The room erupted in murmurs, some supportive, some scornful. Valerius stepped forward, his presence immediately commanding silence. "She speaks truth," he said, his tone absolute, unyielding. "And her courage has saved lives where many of you stood idle. She is under my protection." The declaration reverberated through the halls, both a shield and a warning. Lila felt a surge of gratitude but also an unfamiliar flutter of emotion, something fragile and intoxicating. Valerius' protection was more than power, it was acknowledgement, recognition, and perhaps something deeper. And she realized with a sudden clarity that her bond with him was no longer merely one of survival or obligation. It was woven from threads of mutual respect, trust, and an unspoken understanding that transcended words. That night, in the quiet of the gardens, the frost sparkling under the moonlight, Valerius approached her again. This time, the distance between them was charged with emotion, the silence heavy with meaning. "You have changed everything," he said softly, almost to himself. "You are not merely human. You are extraordinary. And yet, it is your courage, your humility, your heart that draws me to you more than any power could." Lila met his gaze, her pulse quickening. Words felt inadequate, fragile against the weight of centuries and power. Yet, she understood his meaning without a single syllable added. She had always believed that strength lay in survival, in courage, in kindness. And now she realized that it could also lie in connection, between mortal and immortal, human and vampire, courage and love. The following days were a delicate balancing act. Lila continued her acts of bravery, tending to humans in need, navigating court intrigue, and exploring the limits of her newfound power. Valerius watched, both protective and fascinated, offering guidance when necessary but allowing her the freedom to act, to grow, to define her own path. The slow-burn romance between them deepened, not through grand gestures or declarations, but through subtle touches, shared silences, and the quiet acknowledgement of mutual respect and admiration. Yet danger was never far. Rival factions, jealous courtiers, and humans who feared what they could not understand plotted in the shadows. Every action, every decision carried consequences that could ripple through the estate and beyond. And both Lila and Valerius understood that their connection, fragile though it was, would be tested in ways neither could fully predict. As the moon rose high, casting silver light over the frost-kissed gardens, Lila realized something profound. She had faced fear, discovered her power, and survived. And in doing so, she had forged a bond with a being of immense power, a king who had recognized not just her abilities but her heart. She understood that courage was not merely about survival, it was about standing for what was right, about protecting those who could not protect themselves, and about trusting in the goodness within herself, even when the world doubted her. Valerius, standing a few steps away, felt the pull of emotions he had long suppressed. He understood that his centuries of detachment could not shield him from the draw of her courage, her heart, her humanity. And in that understanding he realized that what they shared, this bond forged in courage, respect, and quiet acknowledgement, was the beginning of something that would reshape not only their lives but the very world around them. The Blackthorn estate had never seemed so alive, and yet so perilous. Winter's frost lay thick across the gardens, each petal kissed with silver, each stone glinting like obsidian under the moonlight. The estate was a kingdom of shadows and whispers, where power was measured in centuries and fear flowed as freely as water. Lila walked these halls with purpose, her courage and determination now tempered with wisdom born from trials that had tested not only her body but her spirit. She was no longer the timid human girl who had arrived months ago. She was someone who had faced death, danger, and betrayal, yet remained steadfast, her humanity and heart intact, a beacon in a world ruled by immortals. Yet the final challenge was approaching, one that neither her courage nor her power could fully anticipate. The rival vampire factions, angered by her defiance and the protection Valerius had extended, had conspired in secrecy, gathering allies, seeking to undermine the throne and the fragile peace that the Blackthorn estate represented. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispers of rebellion, of violence, of a human girl who dared to challenge centuries of tradition. And amidst it all, Lila knew that the ultimate test of her courage, her humanity, and her bond with Valerius was imminent. Valerius, for his part, felt the tension keenly. He had spent centuries mastering control, balancing the power of his immortality with the responsibility of leadership. Yet Lila's presence had begun to unravel the careful order he had maintained. She was no longer just a human to be protected. She was a force in her own right, brave, compassionate, and unexpectedly powerful. Her courage had inspired loyalty, even in those who had once doubted her, and her actions had changed the hearts of many within the estate. But as the threat of rebellion grew, he realized that protecting her meant risking everything, not just for himself but for the humans she had vowed to protect and for the balance of power in the immortal world. The first confrontation came in the dead of night. A contingent of rebels, emboldened by rumors and lies, attempted to breach the estate's defenses. Lila, standing at the gates, could see the fear in their eyes. Not all were villains, some were humans manipulated by lies and fear. She could feel the tremor of energy beneath her feet, the pulse of life in the soil, and she drew it into herself, focusing her power to create a protective barrier. Flames, wind, and the faint shimmer of light flowed from her hands, repelling those who sought to harm the innocent. It was a display of both her courage and her control, and it left even the most hardened vampires watching from the battlements in awe. Valerius descended from the towers, his presence immediate, commanding, and absolute. The air shifted as he moved, a predator and protector intertwined, every step measured, every motion deliberate. He did not need to speak, the weight of his authority was enough. Yet, when he reached Lila, his gaze softened, his immense power tempered by concern and admiration. "You have grown stronger," he said quietly, his voice a low hum that vibrated with both warning and praise. "Stronger than I could have imagined. But even the strongest must not bear the weight of the world alone." Lila looked up at him, understanding the dual meaning in his words. She had learned to wield her power, but she knew that guidance, trust, and the presence of someone who believed in her were equally important. "I am not alone," she whispered, her voice steady despite the wind that whipped around them. "I have you, and I will protect those who cannot protect themselves." The battle that followed was both swift and harrowing. The rebels, driven by fear and ambition, attacked with a fury that belied their small numbers. Lila and Valerius moved as one, a seamless combination of human courage and immortal strength. She channeled her energy to protect, heal, and defend, while he struck with precision, ensuring that no life was unnecessarily taken. Together they created a harmony of power and restraint, courage and authority, that left the attackers overwhelmed and ultimately defeated. In the aftermath, the estate lay quiet, the echoes of conflict fading into the night. Lila, exhausted but unbroken, stood in the gardens, the frost sparkling under the moonlight. Valerius approached, his gaze fixed on her, a mixture of pride, admiration, and something deeper simmering in his eyes. "You have faced death and danger and yet remained unwavering," he said. "You are more than human, Lila. You are extraordinary." Her chest swelled with emotion, a mix of relief, pride, and something more fragile, more profound, an awareness that the bond between them had deepened beyond acknowledgement, beyond protection, into something neither of them could deny. "I only did what I had to," she replied softly. "For them. For all of us." He reached out, his hand brushing against hers, a gentle but deliberate gesture. It was a touch that carried centuries of restraint, tempered by the weight of immortality and the stirrings of something human. And in that touch, Lila felt a connection, a bridge between mortal and immortal, courage and power, fear and love. She understood that this bond, forged in trials, respect and shared danger, was the beginning of something eternal. Yet even in victory, challenges remained. The court, the city, and the immortal world beyond the estate had witnessed the rise of a human girl who wielded power with courage and restraint. Some admired her, some feared her, and others plotted in silence, unwilling to accept a mortal who had changed the balance of power. Lila knew that vigilance, wisdom and courage would continue to be necessary. But she also knew that she was no longer fragile, no longer powerless. She had discovered her strength, her humanity, and her place in a world that had once seemed impenetrable. Valerius, observing her from the shadows, realized that his own transformation was equally profound. He had spent centuries in solitude, wielding power with precision but never with the warmth, admiration, or vulnerability that Lila had inspired. She had softened the edges of his immortality, challenged his detachment, and awakened a humanity he had long thought lost. And in doing so, she had claimed a place not only in his life but in his eternity. In the weeks that followed, life in the estate settled into a delicate rhythm. Lila continued her acts of courage and kindness, guiding humans, mediating conflicts and exploring the depths of her powers. Valerius remained both protector and companion, his presence a constant reminder of the fragile balance between mortal courage and immortal authority. Their bond deepened not through words, but through shared glances, subtle gestures and moments of unspoken understanding that spoke louder than any declaration. One evening, as the moon rose high over the frost-kissed gardens, Valerius led Lila to a secluded alcove, a place where centuries of history seemed suspended in the stillness of the night. "You have changed everything," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of centuries, tempered by a tenderness he had never known before. "Not just me, the estate, the humans, even the immortal world. Your courage, your power, your heart, they are forces that cannot be denied." Lila looked up at him, her own heart beating with a fragile, human intensity. "I only did what I could," she whispered. "But you see me? Not as a human, not as fragile, not as powerless. You see me." He stepped closer, the shadows wrapping around them like a protective cocoon. "I see you," he said, the words simple yet carrying centuries of meaning. "I see everything. And I will not let you face this world alone again." In that moment, a quiet understanding passed between them, a recognition that their bond was not merely one of survival or protection, but of trust, respect, and love. It was a love forged in courage, tested by danger, and tempered by the wisdom of both mortal and immortal experience. It was a bond that would endure, fragile yet unbreakable, a tether between two worlds that had long seemed impossible to reconcile. The final challenge came in the form of a revelation. Lila discovered that her gift, the power she had only begun to understand, was connected to an ancient prophecy. One that spoke of a mortal who would bridge the divide between humans and immortals, who would bring compassion and courage to a world ruled by fear and power. She realized that her presence, her courage, and her humanity were not accidents, but part of a greater destiny. And Valerius, standing beside her, understood that their bond was not merely personal, it was a force that could reshape the world. Together, they faced the future with courage and determination, their connection a beacon of hope and strength. The estate, once a place of shadows and whispers, now echoed with the promise of change, of justice, and of the enduring power of humanity in the face of immortality. Lila had found her strength, Valerius had found his humanity, and together, they had discovered a bond that would endure beyond the constraints of time.